Please welcome Janelle Knox-Hayes, Professor of Economic Geography and Planning, Department of Urban Studies and Planning, MIT, and Director, Resilient Communities Lab. Kelsey Wirth, Board Chair and Co-Founder, Mothers Out Front, and moderator Heather Clancy, Vice President and Editorial Director, GreenBiz.
Wow, I just can't believe the talent. And I never answered the question on my last panel, what makes you optimistic? And I would say stuff like that. All the young people out there just pouring their hearts and souls into the message and getting the work done. So thank you, and thank you to the people in this room. You also make me optimistic. We're going to dive deeper into the issue of engagement of local communities, of engaging the people that we need to have in the society to help make these changes. And we've got two great people to address that topic. Again, pretty crazy backgrounds, so definitely look at their bios. You'll be amazed by their previous work as well. But Kelsey, I want to start with you. I'm not a mother. I've been inspired to really write about this because of the young people in my life, though. I'm just curious about how the fact that it's called Mothers Out Front, how does that really shape the actual issues that you do focus on? Because you could choose anything. You could choose many, many, many issues. Yeah. How does that drive where you prioritize your engagement with the communities that you engage?
Well, it really starts with the moms themselves. So Mothers Out Front does not have a brain trust that decides what to focus on. Our work is very much grassroots driven. So it is really about connecting with moms and understanding and helping them focus on what are their concerns, what are they experiencing in their local communities, in their everyday lives, what's affecting their families and their children, and how to connect those dots to the broader climate crisis. So what does that actually look like? So we have teams of moms in California that are pushing back on an oil and gas industry effort to get rid of important setbacks, between oil and gas drilling that's happening behind schools and in neighborhoods in the Los Angeles area in particular. We have teams of moms working on pushing for a transition from dirty diesel buses to electric buses so that children don't have to breathe dirty diesel fumes. We have moms in East Boston where these beautiful murals are that are ensuring that idling at Boston Logan, the pollution from which directly affects those communities, no longer occurs. We have teams in Pueblo, Colorado, securing new air pollution monitoring in the neighborhoods so that more accurate data can serve as a basis for stronger, more protective policies. So it all begins with the moms themselves, what they're experiencing. There is an important strain of health impacts through most of our work, unsurprisingly, because that's generally how the broader climate crisis shows up in people's lives. And ultimately, if we make this about not just pushing on addressing the climate crisis, which of course is what we believe in, but also pushing for climate justice and make it about the lives of families and children, that's how we engage moms in our work.
It is interesting. The health stuff doesn't show up as much as it should in the mainstream media again.
Yes, that's true.
How does your national organization work with the local groups, right? So you have a national priority. By the way, Bezos Earth Fund is doing a lot of work on electric school buses, so you should go talk to them if you haven't. But how's that coordinated?
Well, so again, we start with the local teams. We start with
kind of bubbles up.
Organizing locally. Well, it's both bottom up and top down. Okay. So providing a grassroots structure to organize moms in is absolutely critical to the work that we do because the structure facilitates all the work that follows. So we have community-based teams, and then we have state-based teams. So the community-based teams come together and coordinate on statewide initiatives, and then we have a national sort of organization that supports the organizing staff that provide the training and the coaching and other support to our teams on the ground, and look for opportunities to ensure that there is cross-team learning happening all the time. So we have electric school bus campaigns happening in Southern California, we have them happening in upstate New York, and we have them happening outside of Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. How do we make sure that they're all learning from each other and coordinating where there are opportunities to do that?
Now, Janelle, you know that communities are all different around the world, in different states. So I'm curious, how, you do a lot of research. How do you figure out where you're going to focus in a particular community? Because there's so many different inequities that we're trying to deal with and solve for. How does the system change lens shape, where you go locally?
That's a terrific question. I think this idea of using case studies and then generalizing and networking across different community groups is so critical, because there's a need everywhere, and I think this is something universities like MIT are increasingly realizing, that the power and impact of our work isn't just in the laboratory or in the classroom. There are, especially in the climate challenge, real and meaningful ways that we have an obligation to be out engaging communities. But it is challenging, as you kind of rightfully pointed out. Every community is different. Every context is different. And I think especially when we're going out and meeting frontline and indigenous communities, it's so important to be cognizant of, careful of, considerate of the place-specific context in which those communities are living and what that means to them.
Just to help us out here, because I'm sure a lot of the people in this room probably need to do more of that sort of engagement themselves. What's the best way to approach a community to start that conversation?
Yeah, I think, and I've actually, I direct the Resilient Communities Lab, which is working with a number of different communities on climate adaptation challenges and on energy transition challenges. And I've had it actually both ways, where I've gone out and approached communities, and then I've had communities come to us asking for help. And I think in both circumstances, it's just critical to be really transparent about where you're coming from, what you're doing, and then not to come in necessarily with a set agenda, but to be really open to begin with, to understanding and listening and hearing what's going on, what are the needs, and then, from a research standpoint, transitioning your research so that it begins from the standpoint of what communities need rather than what you necessarily might want to bring to the project.
And actually, sort of building on that comment there of what you don't want to bring in, what are the common mistakes that organizations make?
I
don't want to ask you to call anyone out, but
I have a kind of a specific example that I think this is something we're seeing increasingly with the energy transition. That, for example, the U.S. Solution involves a tremendous amount of offshore wind, 30 gigawatts in New England alone by 2030. And the challenge of offshore wind, it's not really the technical complexity of how do you build or where are these systems sited. Where it becomes really challenging is when the developers then, they've sited, they've built a system, try to look at where's the point of interconnection. How are you going to bring this energy back into the grid? Where are the transmission lines? And more often than not, they end up looking at frontline communities, indigenous communities, because that's where land value is lower. And so there's just sort of this assumption there's going to be less resistance, or it's going to be easier to make that work. And I think, having seen a few of these projects, one of the mistakes is I've seen, for example, different agencies approaching communities and coming in with this big energy vision and how it's going to help the community and help state or federal targets, but it's the first time they've ever approached the community, right? And that's really telling. You don't want your first approach to a community to be, I need something desperately from you. How can we do this together? And so I think in terms of climate change and the work that we're doing, I think it really requires a much more careful consideration about the relationships that we have and what's going to be required to bring together an energy transition, for example.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you, Kelsey, what mistakes you've made in this sort of engagement, and how you've changed policies or procedures that maybe your organization, I mean, actually, how long is Mothers?
We're about 10 years old now.
Yeah.
I described the mistakes we've made. I mean,
Well,
I could take
what have you
all
learned? Lessons
morning.
learned.
Yeah, lessons learned. I mean, I think, so when we started Mothers Out Front, there was a vision for bringing together and organizing, engaging and activating moms from all backgrounds. So if you put, 30 moms in a room together, from all different backgrounds, there's always one thing they will find in common to talk about, and that is their children, their hopes and dreams for their children and their future. So we thought, okay, so this is, because we're moms, we have a real opportunity to organize across difference. So it's kind of like, if we build it, they will come kind of, conception. The vision was there. The intentionality with which one has to go about doing that was not there. So it is not so easy to organize across difference. And sadly, in our increasingly polarized world, that maybe is more difficult in many ways than ever before. However, and so to answer your question, we did not bring the necessary level of intentionality that we should have. And so we've been going through the process in order to build a truly multiracial, cross-class, multi-generational movement where moms from all backgrounds feel they belong. We are rethinking everything about our work. So how we do our work, where we do our work, how we talk about the work that we do, and ensuring that justice is at the center of all that we do. But the original intent and the original vision, I think, is grounded in serious opportunity, which is this notion of having bridging relationships with other people who may come from different backgrounds, may look different from you, may have different lived experience, but when you sit down through a process of developing a relationship and listening and understanding, you discover your shared values, and that's what you come together around. And if you are able to come together around your shared values, you can overlook a lot of the other things that might otherwise separate you from one another.
See you nodding. Just jump in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that issue of wanting to build trust and reciprocity is so critical, and it's one of the things that's so difficult with climate work is there's this sense of urgency that it has to be done rapidly, and if we don't, we're already 2 decades too late. So how do we rapidly catch up? But to do really engaged environmental justice work and to do it well, we have to slow down.
That's right.
And realize that before we even begin, we need a long period of time to plan, but before we even begin that, we have to rebuild relationships. We have to build trust and reciprocity. And so I think that's really, I don't know, maybe taking a moment and realizing we're going to be slower at the outset in the climate planning, but ultimately it will lead to better and longer lasting solutions in the long term.
Yeah.
Much of the, and you mentioned a couple of types of engagement that your organization's done, and in don't do this, let's not do this, let's take, how much work should we be doing on, we need these things, like this infrastructure advocating. So like I see a dialogue in the press right now, there's a lot of NIMBYism going on. No, yes, we need to do this. Oh, but you can't put that here. Right. So we're starting to hit that sort of tipping point, if you will.
Right.
How do we get this activism and engagement to really focus on these are the investments we should make, not just don't do this here? And this is for both of you. Either one of you first. Don't be polite. Jump in.
Well, I'm happy to jump in for just a minute. I mean, we know we need a huge build out of energy infrastructure to support the transition away from dirty fossil fuels to clean energy, right? The question is, how are we going to achieve it? I mean, I guess I would say a few things about that. One is we cannot use the need and the knowledge that we need that build out to justify having that build out take place in the same frontline communities that have been overburdened already with our dirty fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot build this transition on their backs. That is just totally unjust and unacceptable. We do need to build it, however, right? So how do we create those opportunities to actually have people say, yes, that is about organizing and movement building and relationship building on the ground. One of the things that is happening right now is that the strongest anti-clean energy infrastructure voices are oftentimes the fossil fuel industry. So you don't have to peel back very far to discover that what looks like a grassroots opposition effort is in fact being fully funded by and driven by fossil fuel interests. So there is that. And there are real concerns among communities on the ground. So this is a complex area that requires relationship building at the outset. And people need to understand what is necessary, how we're going to do this, ensuring that we're not going to do it on the backs of people living in frontline communities. And I think that's where the area of opportunity is. It's a nuanced question. It's not, do we need permitting reform? Do we not need permitting reform? Of course we need permitting reform. The question is, what does it look like? And that's, that's where we need the engagement of people on the ground to really help think that through.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we built in the School of Architecture and Planning is an equitable resilience framework, and it's trying to get exactly at this question. How do we turn our infrastructure, energy transition, climate transition needs into more equitable and just solutions? Because otherwise we do have this opportunity for the clean energy solutions to overburden communities that have already been burdened. And sort of built into that is this process of how do you engage communities in a meaningful way. With the work I'm doing, for example, with offshore wind, one of the things we've really started to push with it is this idea of co-design of technology, the realization that technology is not just a product, it's a socio-technical system. And so at places like MIT, we tend to want to design and fabricate and engineer in labs. And that's really, yes, that is part of the way to do it. But I think if we want to achieve environmental justice, we have to push our engineering out into the field and engage with these communities. And then they start to set the criteria through their values, their objectives, their needs of what the technology needs to deliver. And in that way, it can start to become a socio-technical system. Heather, I wanted to ask you, though, how you uplift communities in your work with GreenBiz.
Well, one of the things that I'm really trying to do is push companies on this. Often when I ask a corporation what they're doing on environmental justice as part of their climate action, they'll point to their DEI program at their company, and that's just not the right answer. It's great work, but it's not the right answer. So I'm really pushing companies to ask how, when they announce a net zero target, okay, well, what does that include in terms of local engagement and so forth? So that I'm asking questions. I'm not the mainstream media, I guess, but I think with the few minutes that we have left, I'd love to ask each of you 2 questions. So keep your answers short. One is, just what's the most important lesson you've learned? I mean, those were some really great actionable points. I'd love to hear more actionable things. So most important lesson you've learned in this field, some tips for this audience, that they can really take away and use in their own work. So, Kelsey.
So I would say 2 things that I come back to time and again. One is the critical role of relationships and relationship building in any work that you do to engage people and enable people to come together again around their shared values instead of being pushed apart by whatever differences they might have. So relationship is key. Relationships they are the lifeblood of our organizing work at Mothers Out Front. And the second is grassroots infrastructure. So infrastructure is, people start to fall, their eyelids start to droop when they hear the word infrastructure. But in fact, it is what enables all the work. So making sure that there is an infrastructure of enabling people to come together in teams, develop relationships, sustain those relationships, clear decision-making processes and transparent decision-making processes, ways to develop, in our case, the leadership of the moms and other caregivers who get involved in our work. I can't say enough about how that sort of sleepy notion of infrastructure is absolutely key for enabling, all the work that needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. So for me, it's that climate change is all about time. Right? This is sort of the critical factor, and systems of use. All of our economic theories are built on exchange, and to some extent, we're still trying to exchange our way out of this problem, and that's not going to work. We need to build better systems of use. And so sort of in that vein, one thing I want to mention is the Native Land Conservancy. I think this came up with Earth Fund and their 30/30 initiative of conserving 30% of resources and land. The Native Land Conservancy, which was co-founded by Deanna Ruiz and Leslie Jonas, our students are actually with them right now doing some work on the Wampanoag Common Lands. But they've created this amazing cultural respect easement, and they've partnered with the state of Massachusetts to further develop this that allows conservation lands to be used in perpetuity by indigenous tribes. It gives kind of respects this conservation idea, but then allows the original intent of stewardship by indigenous communities. And I think that's a really fantastic way to demonstrate the principles of use.
Right. In the few seconds we have left, what makes you optimistic, Kelsey?
The women and moms who are leaders in our growing movement at Mothers Out Front, and the notion that anybody, any of you in the audience, anybody watching this, has an opportunity to step into leadership and play a role in driving transformational change that we need in order to ensure a just and equitable and vibrant future for our children and grandchildren.
Janelle?
For me, President Cornwall's inauguration address, where she basically said it's not enough for MIT to contribute to the knowledge base. What is our contribution going to be? And I think that's not just a call to MIT. I think it's a call to all of academia, and it's time we did more.
Nice.
Great. Well, thank you so much for both of you.